The shadows of war crept silently into the heart of the Congo in the late 1990s, unseen by many but deeply felt by those who lived through it. The origins of Rwanda's involvement in the Democratic Republic of Congo, D.R.C., lie in the tragic aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, which rose to power after toppling the Hutu-led government, found itself surrounded by a threat that refused to disappear, the Hutu militias responsible for the genocide, now entrenched in eastern Congo. These militias had fled to the vast and lawless forests of the D.R.C., where they continued to launch attacks on Rwanda, a source of constant insecurity. But what began as a defense of national borders would soon morph into something far more complicated, an invasion cloaked in secrecy. In the years following the genocide, Rwanda was a nation under siege, both literally and figuratively. Despite the RPF's victory and the international community's approval of their actions, the genocidal ideology had not been eradicated. Hutu extremists, along with remnants of the old regime, found sanctuary in the D.R.C., from where they plotted further attacks. For Rwanda, this was an existential threat. The government's fears grew, as the presence of these armed militias in the border regions was not only a military challenge but a psychological one. How could a country still healing from a genocide allow such a destabilizing force to exist so close? The decision was made: Rwanda would have to intervene militarily in the D.R.C. to neutralize the Hutu militias and secure its borders. But this intervention would not be as clear-cut as a typical military operation. Rwanda's strategy was not just about crossing borders with soldiers, it was about manipulating regional dynamics, forging alliances, and employing proxy forces in a shadow war that would leave no fingerprints. The world would not fully understand the extent of this conflict until years later, when the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and military strategies began to unfold. Rwanda's first steps in the D.R.C. came under the guise of support for rebel groups fighting against the corrupt Zairian government of Mobutu Sese Seko. By 1996, the Zairian regime was on its last legs. Mobutu's government had long been a source of instability in the region, and Rwanda, along with Uganda, saw an opportunity to back Laurent Desire Kabila's rebellion against Mobutu. This alliance between Rwanda and Kabila was initially a tactical one, aimed at removing a common enemy. But it would soon turn into a bitter betrayal, as Kabila's government began to pivot away from Rwanda's interests, setting the stage for further conflict. As the Rwandan forces entered the D.R.C. under the banner of regional stability, the world was largely silent. The international community was more concerned with the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda, while the D.R.C.'s internal strife was seen as just another episode in Africa's endless cycle of conflict. Yet beneath the surface, Rwanda's intervention was not just about confronting a rogue militia, it was about asserting control over a volatile region that had become a battlefield for international influence. Rwanda had no choice but to act in its own defense, but its actions would create ripples that would affect not just the D.R.C., but the entire African continent. The relationship between Rwanda and Laurent Desire Kabila's rebel group, which had toppled Mobutu Sese Seko, was forged out of necessity, but it would soon unravel into one of the most complex betrayals in modern African history. In 1996, Rwanda and Uganda backed Kabila's alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, with the primary aim of removing Mobutu from power. Rwanda, whose leadership was still recovering from the brutal genocide, saw the fall of Mobutu as an opportunity to deal with the Hutu militias threatening its borders. However, Kabila's promise to address the Hutu threat soon proved to be an illusion, and what followed would change the course of the conflict entirely. Upon seizing power in 1997, Kabila quickly shifted his focus, becoming increasingly wary of the very forces that had helped him reach the presidency. Tensions between Kabila and his Rwandan and Ugandan allies began to simmer as he distanced himself from them. He viewed the continued presence of foreign forces in Congo as a threat to his sovereignty. Rwanda, on the other hand, had invested heavily in Kabila's rise, hoping for a stable ally who would rid eastern Congo of the Hutu militias. Kabila's refusal to deal decisively with the militias and his efforts to consolidate power under his rule led Rwanda to believe it had been betrayed by a man they had made into a ruler. In 1998, Kabila's distrust of Rwanda reached its peak when he ordered the expulsion of Rwandan troops from Congo. This marked a dramatic shift in the region's power dynamics. Rwanda responded swiftly and aggressively, backing a new rebel group, the Congolese Rally for Democracy, RCD, which was composed of dissident Congolese forces and Tutsi elements. This new coalition aimed to overthrow Kabila's government and establish a new political order, one that was far more favorable to Rwanda's interests. The RCD, which operated from Rwanda, became an extension of Rwandan military power in Congo, with Rwanda using it as a proxy to secure its regional ambitions. At the heart of this betrayal was the political struggle for control over the eastern D.R.C., a region rich in natural resources, including gold, diamonds, and coltan. Rwanda's involvement was not purely driven by security concerns but by economic interests as well. The DRC's vast mineral wealth was a significant draw, and Rwanda's military strategy in the region was designed to secure economic access to these resources while simultaneously dismantling the militias that threatened its stability. Kabila, however, saw these foreign interventions as a power grab, which made the rift between him and his former allies even more profound. The fallout from Kabila's expulsion of Rwandan forces led to the Second Congo War, which would engulf much of Central Africa in a devastating conflict. Kabila's growing suspicion of Rwanda was also fueled by internal political pressures. He needed to consolidate power within the DRC and protect his regime from a multitude of domestic and international challenges. His decision to distance himself from Rwanda ultimately set off a chain of events that would plunge Congo deeper into instability. Rwanda's support for the RCD and the subsequent backing of various rebel factions, including those in the eastern DRC, turned Congo into a battleground for competing forces, both foreign and domestic. The war, which was initially a proxy conflict, soon escalated into a full-scale regional war involving multiple African countries, including Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, all of whom had interests in Congo's resources. The betrayal of Rwanda by Kabila was not just a diplomatic failure, it was a strategic miscalculation that would have lasting consequences for both countries. Rwanda's decision to intervene in Congo without Kabila's cooperation made the conflict even more complex and marked the beginning of a long-running struggle for control over Congo's eastern regions. Kabila, despite his initial victory, would find himself caught between foreign military interventions, internal uprisings, and the constant pressure of managing a fractured state. For Rwanda, Kabila's betrayal turned the relationship from one of opportunistic alliance to one of shadow warfare, with Rwanda increasingly acting as both a covert operator and a direct combatant in Congo's internal conflicts. The shifting alliances and betrayals of this period set the stage for the prolonged instability that would define the Congo for years to come. Rwanda's military strategy in the Democratic Republic of Congo, D.R.C., during the late 1990s and early 2000s was a masterclass in covert warfare. From the beginning of the Second Congo War in 1998, Rwanda understood that a direct, conventional military approach would not be sufficient in achieving its objectives. Instead, Rwanda relied on a complex mix of military tactics, including proxy warfare, the manipulation of rebel factions, and strategic support for local militias. The primary goal was clear: neutralize the Hutu militias in eastern Congo, secure the region's mineral-rich territories, and maintain regional dominance, all while avoiding full-scale international intervention or accountability. Rwanda's use of proxy forces was one of its most effective strategies. By backing various rebel groups, such as the RCD, Rassemblement Congolais pour la Démocratie, Rwanda was able to wage war through intermediaries rather than directly engaging the Congolese government or other foreign powers. The RCD, with strong ties to Rwanda's Tutsi-led government, operated in eastern DRC with the active support of the Rwandan military. This allowed Rwanda to maintain a degree of plausible deniability in its actions, since the international community was focused on the rebel nature of the conflict rather than recognizing the Rwandan state's deep involvement. The rebel groups, though nominally independent, were in fact heavily dependent on Rwanda for military support, logistics, and strategy. In addition to using proxy forces, Rwanda's military conducted direct operations aimed at dismantling the Hutu militias that had taken refuge in the DRC following the Rwandan genocide. These militias, most notably the FDLR, Forces Démocratiques de Libération du Rwanda, were well entrenched in the DRC's vast and difficult terrain. Rwanda's military superiority was crucial in forcing these groups into submission. Special operations units conducted targeted raids into the DRC, eliminating key militia leaders, while simultaneously fortifying Rwanda's presence in the region. These operations were characterized by speed, surprise, and a high degree of coordination with Rwandan intelligence networks. While successful in eliminating some of the militia's leadership, this strategy also contributed to the escalating chaos and humanitarian disaster in the DRC. The battle for control over eastern DRC was not solely about military conquest, it was also about controlling the region's vast natural resources. The mineral-rich provinces of Katanga and Kivu became focal points of the conflict. Rwanda, through its military influence and alliances with local militias, ensured that it had access to valuable resources such as coltan, gold, and diamonds. These resources became a key component of Rwanda's strategy to fund and sustain its military operations in Congo. Rwanda's exploitation of DRC's natural wealth was not a hidden secret, it became one of the most controversial aspects of the conflict. Rwanda's critics, particularly in the international community, accused it of looting Congo's resources to finance its war machine, further compounding the ethical dilemmas surrounding the intervention. Despite the success of these military tactics, Rwanda's strategy was not without its challenges. The DRC's geography, characterized by dense forests, mountainous terrain, and difficult river systems, made military operations arduous. Moreover, Rwanda's military faced the ever-present threat of retaliatory attacks from both the Congolese government and rival militias. While Rwanda's forces were tactically proficient, they also struggled with maintaining control over the vast and fragmented territory they sought to dominate. The presence of numerous armed groups, each with varying political allegiances and ethnic motivations, further complicated the military landscape. The continuous state of instability in eastern DRC, with shifting alliances and hostile forces, created a perpetual environment of conflict that Rwanda was never fully able to stabilize, despite its military successes. In conclusion, Rwanda's military strategy in Congo was defined by a combination of indirect warfare, resource control, and rapid, targeted interventions. The use of proxy forces, covert operations, and strategic manipulation of the local landscape allowed Rwanda to assert its influence while maintaining a facade of limited involvement. However, these strategies contributed to the deepening of the conflict in Congo and fostered a cycle of violence that would continue to plague the region for decades. The military successes achieved through these methods would ultimately prove to be Pyrrhic, as they sowed the seeds for continued instability and human suffering in the DRC. The military intervention of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, D.R.C., was not only a struggle for territorial control but also a battle with profound cultural and political ramifications. At the heart of the conflict lay deep-rooted ethnic tensions that had existed for centuries, exacerbated by colonial legacies and the horrors of the Rwandan genocide. The intervention exacerbated the already fragile political and cultural fabric of the DRC, leading to a transformation in regional power dynamics, ethnic relations, and national identities. Rwanda's military involvement in Congo directly impacted the ethnic composition of the eastern DRC. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, dominated by Tutsis, framed their intervention as a security measure, protecting Rwanda's borders from Hutu militias that had taken refuge in the DRC after the 1994 genocide. However, the Tutsi-dominated forces inadvertently deepened ethnic divisions in Congo. In eastern Congo, where ethnic groups like the Hutu and Tutsi had historically interacted in complex, often peaceful relationships, the presence of Rwandan forces shifted the balance of power. Tutsi populations in the region became increasingly aligned with Rwanda, while Hutu communities, particularly those suspected of having ties to the genocidal regime, found themselves targeted by both Rwandan troops and local militias. These actions further entrenched the ethnic divide, sparking widespread mistrust between communities that had lived side by side for generations. Politically, Rwanda's intervention shattered the already fragile Congolese state. The central government in Kinshasa, led by Laurent Desire Kabila, had struggled to maintain authority even before the Rwandan invasion. Kabila's regime was quickly thrust into a complex web of external influence, with Rwanda, Uganda, and other neighboring countries playing pivotal roles in shaping the political future of the D.R.C. Rwanda's backing of the RCD, Rassemblement Congolais pour la Démocratie, a group of Congolese rebels who sought to overthrow Kabila's government, further destabilized the D.R.C. The result was a fragmented political landscape in which multiple factions vied for control, not just of the government but of the very sovereignty of the country. Rwanda's actions in supporting rebel groups created a proxy war where power was constantly shifting, and Kabila's inability to control the country became evident. The involvement of foreign powers, particularly Rwanda, in Congo's internal politics led to accusations of neo-colonialism. Many Congolese viewed Rwanda's presence in the country as an attempt to impose its will and control over the region's resources, rather than a legitimate intervention for regional security. The D.R.C.'s vast mineral wealth, coltan, diamonds, gold, was a major motivating factor for Rwanda's strategic interests, but it also added an economic layer to the conflict that transformed the political struggle into a battle for economic dominance. Rwanda's access to these resources gave it leverage, both politically and militarily, and allowed it to finance its military operations in Congo. However, this also made Rwanda a target of international condemnation, as its exploitation of the D.R.C.'s resources further entrenched its role in destabilizing the region. Culturally, the effects of Rwanda's invasion rippled beyond the immediate political fallout. The Rwandan genocide had already left deep scars on the Tutsi-Hutu relationship, not just in Rwanda but across the Great Lakes region. In Congo, Rwanda's intervention revived old hostilities, but also introduced new ones. Congolese Tutsis, often seen as aligned with Rwanda, became a target for Congolese Hutu groups, while the local Hutu populations in Congo found themselves scapegoated by both Rwandan forces and Congolese militias. In the midst of this ethnic strife, a fragile sense of Congolese nationalism was tested, as various ethnic groups sought to assert their rights to land, power, and identity in a country ravaged by war. The division along ethnic lines often masked the true underlying issues of governance, economic control, and the struggle for sovereignty. Ultimately, Rwanda's invasion of Congo deeply altered the political and cultural landscape of the region. What began as an intervention to safeguard Rwanda's security interests evolved into a struggle for control over the future of the D.R.C. While Rwanda's immediate goals were largely military, neutralizing the Hutu militias and securing economic advantages, the cultural and political repercussions of their actions would have far-reaching consequences. The D.R.C. was plunged into further instability, ethnic tensions were exacerbated, and the broader region was left with the legacy of Rwanda's shadow war, a conflict that redefined political allegiances, reshaped cultural identities, and left a nation fractured along deeply entrenched lines. The political and cultural implications of Rwanda's intervention in Congo set the stage for a conflict that would continue to haunt the region for years to come. Rwanda's shadow invasion of Congo was not just a bilateral conflict, it drew in foreign powers whose influence shaped the outcome of the war and the broader regional dynamics. The involvement of neighboring countries, international bodies, and global powers transformed what might have been a localized struggle into a far-reaching geopolitical crisis. While Rwanda sought to maintain control over the eastern D.R.C., its actions were influenced by strategic alliances, economic interests, and the broader balance of power in Central Africa. As Rwanda maneuvered through a labyrinth of alliances, betrayals, and rivalries, the role of foreign powers and the controversies surrounding their involvement became pivotal to understanding the conflict. One of the most contentious aspects of Rwanda's intervention was the support it received from Uganda, which had its own interests in the D.R.C. Both Rwanda and Uganda had a shared goal in removing Mobutu from power and in establishing a friendly regime in Congo. However, their partnership was fraught with tensions, particularly when it came to the exploitation of Congo's natural resources. Uganda, like Rwanda, sought to secure access to the wealth of the D.R.C.'s mineral-rich provinces, such as Katanga and Kivu. Both nations saw the vast resources of the D.R.C. as vital to their economic survival and military endeavors, creating an environment in which economic gain often took precedence over diplomatic norms. This competition for resources, along with political rivalries, would later contribute to the destabilization of the entire region. The United States and Western powers also played an indirect role in Rwanda's intervention. Initially, many Western nations, particularly the U.S., were supportive of Rwanda's efforts to neutralize the Hutu militias that had fled into Congo. The U.S. viewed the Rwandan government's actions as a legitimate counterterrorism measure, given the threat posed by the genocidal forces still operating along the border. However, as the conflict escalated and Rwanda's objectives became more ambitious, Western support began to wane. The international community, led by the United Nations and the European Union, grew increasingly concerned about Rwanda's increasing military footprint in Congo, especially as accusations of resource exploitation, human rights abuses, and violations of Congolese sovereignty mounted. The United Nations and other international bodies struggled to address the growing crisis. The UN peacekeeping mission in Congo, known as MONUC, was ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the conflict. The mission was criticized for its inability to prevent atrocities, protect civilians, or mediate between the various factions involved. The UN's lack of a coherent strategy in Congo was compounded by the divided nature of international interests. While some nations, particularly in Africa, advocated for an end to foreign intervention and a return to Congolese sovereignty, others, particularly the West, remained silent or passively supported Rwanda's actions, fearing a broader regional instability that could affect their economic interests. The lack of a unified international response to the crisis only served to embolden Rwanda and its allies in pursuing their objectives with little regard for the broader geopolitical consequences. Rwanda's actions were also deeply controversial for their role in the perpetuation of ethnic violence and human rights abuses. Rwanda's military operations in eastern Congo, aimed at neutralizing Hutu militias, often led to the displacement of civilian populations, mass killings, and widespread suffering. Reports from international human rights organizations and the United Nations painted a grim picture of atrocities committed by both Rwandan forces and the various militias operating in the region. The Rwandan government, under President Paul Kagame, has consistently denied accusations of human rights violations, but the evidence of war crimes remains undeniable. These violations were not just limited to the battlefield, they extended to the exploitation of Congo's resources and the destruction of the country's infrastructure, leading to the destabilization of an already fragile state. In the end, the role of foreign powers in the conflict revealed the complexity and ethical dilemmas of international intervention in Africa. Rwanda's military actions in Congo were, at their core, driven by security concerns and the desire for regional dominance, but they were also shaped by external actors whose interests often aligned with or opposed Rwanda's objectives. The controversies surrounding these interventions, particularly with regards to resource exploitation, human rights violations, and the manipulation of local politics, left an indelible mark on the conflict. Rwanda's actions, though justified by some as necessary for national security, have had long-lasting effects on both the D.R.C. and the wider African continent. The involvement of foreign powers in the Congo crisis ensured that the conflict would not remain a local issue but would instead reverberate throughout the region, with implications for African unity, international law, and the ethics of intervention. The Second Congo War, which began in 1998, quickly escalated into one of the most complex and devastating conflicts in African history. For Rwanda, the primary objective was clear: neutralize the Hutu militias that had taken refuge in eastern Congo and prevent any future threats to its security. However, the intervention also came to represent a larger struggle for control of the region's vast natural resources and the balance of political power in Central Africa. As the war dragged on, the political landscape in both Rwanda and the D.R.C. shifted, and the conflict began to take on a more geopolitical dimension, setting the stage for the eventual fall of Laurent Desire Kabila's regime and the broader implications of Rwanda's actions. Rwanda's military support for the Congolese rebel groups, especially the Rassemblement Congolais pour la Démocratie, RCD, played a crucial role in the eventual downfall of Kabila's government. The RCD, although presented as a Congolese movement, was in reality a proxy force heavily backed by Rwanda. The group's main objectives aligned with Rwanda's: the removal of Kabila, the dismantling of Hutu militias, and the establishment of a new political order in eastern D.R.C. that would be more sympathetic to Rwanda's interests. The RCD's military successes, combined with Rwanda's covert support, created a strong military pressure on Kabila's forces, which were already weakened by internal divisions and external threats. Kabila's loss of control over the eastern provinces marked the beginning of the end of his regime. However, Kabila's ability to hold on to power was not entirely dependent on his military forces. He found new allies in the form of Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, who provided substantial military support in a bid to counter Rwanda's intervention. The involvement of these countries turned what was initially a regional conflict into a broader, multifaceted war that drew in several African powers. Despite their intervention, Kabila's position continued to weaken. The pressure from Rwanda and its allies eventually proved too much for Kabila, who was forced to make several political and military concessions. By 2001, after the assassination of Laurent Desire Kabila, his son, Joseph Kabila, ascended to the presidency. Joseph inherited a country in tatters, with the eastern provinces still under the influence of Rwandan-backed forces. The ascension of Joseph Kabila brought a temporary shift in the political dynamics of the D.R.C. Rwanda, now a significant power player in Congolese politics, sought to secure its strategic interests through diplomatic negotiations. Rwanda's military involvement in Congo remained crucial in the aftermath of Laurent Kabila's death. Despite Joseph Kabila's attempts to consolidate power, the D.R.C. remained unstable, with ongoing conflicts between various rebel groups, the Congolese government, and foreign powers like Rwanda. The situation in eastern D.R.C. remained a flashpoint, as militias continued to destabilize the region, often with the tacit approval or support of neighboring countries like Rwanda. Rwanda's military success in the region, while not leading to a direct annexation, allowed it to exercise significant influence over the future of the eastern D.R.C. In the larger context of African geopolitics, Rwanda's military intervention had profound consequences for regional stability. The conflict set the stage for the eventual involvement of foreign powers such as the United Nations and Western nations, who sought to mediate and stabilize the region. However, their efforts often came too late and were undermined by the entrenched interests of the African powers involved. Rwanda's covert operations in the D.R.C. and its ability to manipulate the situation on the ground helped establish its dominance over the Great Lakes region. By the end of the Second Congo War in 2003, Rwanda had emerged as a key regional player, exerting significant influence over the political future of the D.R.C. Yet, despite this apparent success, Rwanda's involvement in Congo left a legacy of instability, ethnic division, and continued violence that would linger for years to come. The D.R.C.'s eventual transition to a new political order, with a fragile peace process and the establishment of a transitional government in 2003, marked the end of Kabila's regime but not the end of Rwanda's involvement in Congolese affairs. Rwanda's role in the war, while strategically advantageous in the short term, led to ongoing controversy and instability in the region. The consequences of Rwanda's intervention, both politically and militarily, reverberated throughout the Great Lakes region, reshaping the balance of power and leaving a lasting imprint on the geopolitics of Africa. Rwanda's road to conquest in the D.R.C. was not just a military campaign, it was a calculated effort to reshape the political, cultural, and economic landscape of a region that would remain in turmoil long after the guns fell silent. The aftermath of Rwanda's intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, D.R.C., left a region scarred by decades of violence, ethnic divisions, and political instability. Despite the official end of the Second Congo War in 2003, the consequences of Rwanda's actions continue to reverberate throughout Central Africa. The D.R.C., once a nation of immense natural wealth and potential, was left fragmented, its sovereignty undermined by both internal and external forces. Rwanda's military intervention, while securing short-term objectives such as neutralizing Hutu militias and gaining control over strategic territories, ultimately led to the further destabilization of a fragile state. The situation in the D.R.C. remained precarious, with sporadic violence continuing for years after the war. In the years following the war, eastern D.R.C. remained a flashpoint of conflict, with various armed groups vying for control of the region's abundant mineral resources. Rwanda's involvement, though officially diminished, persisted through indirect means, with Kigali continuing to support local militias and rebel factions that aligned with its interests. The presence of the FDLR, Forces Démocratiques de Libération du Rwanda, composed of Hutu extremists who had fled to the D.R.C. after the 1994 genocide, remained a central issue in Rwanda's security concerns. The failure to fully eradicate these groups resulted in Rwanda's continued involvement in the region, often under the guise of counterterrorism operations, but with significant ramifications for both the D.R.C. and neighboring countries. The legacy of Rwanda's intervention is also defined by its lasting impact on the political landscape of the Great Lakes region. Rwanda, once seen as a model of stability and recovery following the genocide, emerged as a key player in regional geopolitics. However, its actions in the D.R.C. fostered deep animosity among many Congolese and neighboring states. Rwanda's support for various rebel groups in the D.R.C. fueled the perception of neo-colonialism, as many Congolese saw Rwanda's intervention as an attempt to exert control over Congo's political future and resources. This perception further complicated regional relations, as countries like Uganda, Angola, and Zimbabwe, which had supported Kabila during the war, remained wary of Rwanda's expanding influence. The D.R.C., while rebuilding, found itself trapped in a web of regional rivalries and distrust, unable to fully regain control over its vast territories. Internationally, Rwanda's actions in Congo were met with mixed reactions. While some Western nations, particularly the United States, initially supported Rwanda's intervention as a legitimate effort to eliminate genocidal forces, this support waned as the conflict escalated. Accusations of resource exploitation, human rights abuses, and violations of Congolese sovereignty led to international condemnation. The United Nations, despite its peacekeeping presence in the D.R.C., was unable to effectively address the complexities of the conflict. The lack of a unified international response allowed Rwanda to pursue its interests with relative impunity. In the aftermath, the international community faced the difficult challenge of balancing Rwanda's security concerns with the sovereignty of the D.R.C., resulting in a fractured and ineffective diplomatic approach to the crisis. Rwanda's involvement in Congo ultimately left a complex and troubling legacy that continues to shape the political and cultural landscape of the region. The instability in the D.R.C., exacerbated by Rwanda's military intervention, contributed to the ongoing challenges faced by the Congolese government in asserting its authority and rebuilding its institutions. The exploitation of Congo's resources, both by local and foreign actors, has continued to fuel conflict, while the deep ethnic divide stirred by Rwanda's involvement remain a source of tension. Rwanda, despite its political and military successes, is now faced with the challenge of reconciling its past actions in the D.R.C. with its aspirations for regional stability and cooperation. In conclusion, the shadow invasion of Congo by Rwanda was not just a war for territory, it was a struggle for power, resources, and regional dominance that would reshape the Great Lakes region for decades. The consequences of Rwanda's actions, both positive and negative, are still felt today, as the D.R.C. continues to recover from years of war and instability. Rwanda's legacy in Congo is one of strategic success tempered by profound ethical and political questions, leaving a region still grappling with the costs of war, betrayal, and the pursuit of influence. The Rwanda-D.R.C. conflict serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of intervention, the consequences of foreign influence, and the enduring impact of colonial legacies on Africa's modern struggles. If you found this story enlightening, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more hidden truths about Africa's history, conflicts, and untold stories that shaped our world.